Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Church Sunday School class department and the ladies class, and we are in the midst of studying Daniel. Daniel is in the Old Testament. The book of Daniel is, and Daniel has 12 chapters. 6 are historical, telling us about the life of Daniel and the Israelite people, the Hebrew people at that time. And then the last 6 chapters are prophetic, telling us visions and dreams that God allowed Daniel to have. And they are very prophetic. And we studied Revelation, and a lot of these things are very reminiscent of what happens in Revelation. So we're going to read the first 3 verses in chapter 6. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps may be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. In chapter 5, we saw the writing on the wall and the fall of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, and the taking over from the Medo-Persian empire. We saw in chapter 2 of Daniel the prophecy that Daniel was given and that he shared with Nebuchadnezzar, that Nebuchadnezzar's the head of the statue, if you remember, and that he would be the greatest but that his empire would end, and the next empire would be the torso, the shoulders, and it would be the Medo-Persians. So here we're seeing that come about. Daniel has lived through the Babylonian Empire, and now he is beginning into the Medo-Persian Empire. In these 3 verses, you're going to meet Darius, who is the king or the lead regent at that time. He was over all this Babylonian territory, and he had 120 men under him that some he had brought in, and some that were already in position as minor rulers over in our day and time we would say over states or counties or regions or whatever, but they needed 120 fellows to govern, and he put over that 120 3 men that were elevated as their supervisors or as their governors. So Daniel was one of those men. We're not told the names of the other 2, but we're told Daniel, who was given a third of the Babylonian Empire right before it fell, and so we see him being recognized as a leader by Darius when Darius comes on the throne. And so Darius sets him as one of the 3 governors over the regions. If you can kind of envision it as you have Darius at the top, and then he has underneath him 3 commissioners. And then under those commissioners are 120 different governmental employees, if you will, that were under the 3 commissioners. So if we made it even, it would be like each commissioner had 40 governors under him, mayors under him. And what was their purpose? So that Darius wouldn't suffer loss. Well, what kind of loss are we talking about? The king did not want to suffer loss, and he's talking about money. He didn't want to lose any money. So these 3 commissioners was to make sure that the 120 mayors underneath them put down any military revolts, that they collected the taxes they should, that they persecuted tax evasion, and they looked out for any kind of fraud because Darius was concerned that he wanted to run a tight ship. So he had these three governors, if you will, watching over his land, and these three commissioners. I don't know how much talk they had among each other, but we'll call Daniel one of the vice regents. Okay, so Daniel, let's read 4, 5, and 6. Then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. And these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Then the commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius live forever. Okay, so you have the satraps, 120, the other commissioners, there would have been 2 others. They had a secret meeting, a secret getting together, and they wanted to get rid of Daniel. Why would they want to have gotten rid of Daniel? Most people are driven by money. Did you know that? So being under Daniel's reign, Daniel was halting a lot of ways that they were making money. Well, how did the king think that he was losing money? Why did he put these men up to start with? He put them up because there was fraud, rampant fraud. There was tax evasion. There was not even paying of taxes in some instances. And all of that was being affected by the integrity of Daniel. So they wanted to get rid of him. They were jealous of him. Remember, he had already been rewarded from Nebuchadnezzar. He was an outsider. He was a man who was brought as a young boy into Babylon, and he wasn't a born Babylonian, and he gained favor everywhere he was. And here's Darius is inferring bonuses on to him, and they were jealous, and they did not want him there. To say that it pleased Darius to set these men apart, Darius has thought about it and come up with a plan on how to rule. Darius was a military man, and this was civil, and he wanted someone who could help him to rule and keep the peace and everything in a civil setting. So he was pleased to get these 3, and he thought he had a good system set up. But now we're seeing a plot being conceived and initiated. First of all, they met together to see if someone in their group knew of a weakness that they could promote, that they could talk about Daniel's weakness. But the more they talked, they couldn't come up with one. Not 122 men meeting could they come up with an instance of where Daniel had accepted a bribe, or Daniel had lied about something, or where he had been unfaithful or an unfaithful steward. They couldn't come up with it because he was a faithful man. He was an honest man, full of great integrity. And you know, when someone is under this kind of scrutiny, it's remarkable that out of the 122 of them, they couldn't say, well, you know, I remember that time when Daniel did this or could have done that, and someone else would say, no, that's not true. That won't stand. We can't go from that route. So they said, well, what is the most remarkable thing about Daniel? The most remarkable thing about Daniel is the way he served his God, how devoted he was, and how faithful he was, that 3 times a day he would pray to his God, that Daniel was a man of great integrity. And so if we're going to find anything, we need to look at the way he serves his God. Maybe there's something in there that would be against the Medo-Persian laws. So they began to look. Someone in the midst figured out a plan. Medo-Persians had a very stringent law in that they really thought of their leadership, their kings, as minor deities. And as minor deities, they didn't make mistakes. As minor deities, whatever they said was law, because as minor deities, they knew it all and nothing could be left to change because they were 100% trustworthy, because they were minor deities themselves. So they looked into that and they said, you know, if one of the leaders, if Darius were to make a law, because the Medo-Persians didn't believe that their leaders could make a mistake, that meant they couldn't say, I've changed my mind about that law. I've made an error about that law. I want to set that law aside. No, once they put their name at the bottom of a law, it was enforced. And that's the way it was, because they were incapable of making an error. So they said, let's sneak one in on him. Let's flatter him. You know, a lot of us are susceptible to lies if we hear flattering words before. Let's kind of shade the truth to him. And let's see if we can get him to sign a paper that says that nobody is to worship any other entity but the ruler, the Medo-Persian ruler, for a short time, for 30 days. Well, let's see if we can catch Daniel that way. So if you'll notice, they went in verse 6. Let's read verse 6, 7, and 8. Then these commissioners, these two, there's only 3, and I doubt very seriously if Daniel was in this group, so it would have been 2 of them. Then these commissioners and the satraps came by agreement to the king, and they spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. All of the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the high officials and the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now look how they are building him up. First of all, they've got a party going on. They have all the satraps, that's 120. They have 2 of the commissioners, that's 122 in total. And then they add that into that there's other people there too, and they're just patting the king on the shoulder and telling him what a good job he's done, how much they revere him, and as a way to elevate him, to honor him, to memorialize him, they want to have a law that says that anybody caught praying to anybody else other than Darius would be fed to the lions for 30 days. Darius's pride and his desire for a unified kingdom, you've got to remember, he wants to bring this kingdom together under peace. And so he's saying, here's something that all of the leaders of the people want. They want to honor me. And I'm a big military. I've conquered this land. They want to honor me. I'm going to let them. He never thought any further. It didn't dawn on him the results of what was being asked of him. When they suggested that they set an ordinance that no one worship any other god but Darius for 30 days, I don't think for a minute that Darius, when he looked around, I don't think he realized that Daniel wasn't there. I don't think he had any clue at all that this would have any effect on Daniel at all. Perhaps he had not grown to know Daniel that well, although he had made up a secondary plan. He had been watching Daniel enough to know Daniel's integrity, because he had we've already read that he had planned to eventually set Daniel over everything. Not have 3 governors, but to have one. So I think he was a little naive here. He didn't know these folks well enough, and he didn't understand that their real object in getting him to sign this ordinance was the destruction of Daniel. So Daniel's enemies knew that the people could be persuaded to do things they normally wouldn't do if they thought everybody else approved of that. And that happens in our day and time too, doesn't it? If you have someone who's really vocal, who's putting their piece forward, if you will, sometimes it's easy just to listen and let it and be led. So, in verse 7, in verse 9, therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction, the ordination. All right, now verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had his windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Daniel was a man of faith and a man of habits. 3 times in a day in the temple in Jerusalem, they made offerings 3 times a day. The temple was no longer. But Daniel remembers the temple. Daniel remembers how he used to worship as a child, as a young man, very young man. So the best he could do was go to the windows that faced Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he offered up prayer to his God. This was something he did day in and day out. His friends and his enemies alike would have known what he normally did. This is what the satraps and the commissioners were banking on. That Daniel would have the courage and the integrity that even though he knew that there was an ordinance, a law, if you would, stating that he can't do it for 30 days or be thrown in the lion's den, the question was, would he or would he not continue to worship? You know, it would have been easy. Daniel could have, instead of going to the rooftop, he could have went to the floor underneath the second story, a room underneath it that had one narrow window, and he could back up to where he couldn't be seen from that window, and he could pray there in the quiet and in the dim light and worship his Lord from there and stay safe. But that wasn't what Daniel did. Daniel maintained the witness and the integrity that he had displayed for now 83, 84 years. And that was praying to his God as an open witness. Daniel's faithfulness to God is what ended up having him condemned to the lion's den. Let's read verse 12. We'll read 12 through 15. Then they approached, and they is the 120 satraps and the 2 commissioners. Then they approached and they spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man that makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be put into the lion's den? Didn't you make that ordinance? Didn't you sign that ordinance, King Darius? And the king replied, that statement's true. According to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. That's true, I signed it. and it's something that can't be revoked. So don't come in here and ask me to change my mind, because I've already signed it. It's a fact complete. Verse 13. Then they answered and they spoke before the king. Well, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O God, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. There's a man, he's not even native to here. Look how they, in the way they're presenting this, they're demoting or attempting to demote Daniel. Daniel is in high regards. Daniel has really made inroads with Darius. Darius counts him as very dependable, one of his allies in this country. And they're throwing shade at him, buddy, big time. He's one of those exiles from Judah. And he's ignoring the petition that you signed. He's doing worse than ignoring it. He is just flagrantly right out in the open. Anybody can see him through his open window 3 times a day, not once, but 3 times a day. He's making his penance. As soon as the king, in verse 14, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Recognize, O king, that this is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. As soon as they made Darius aware, Darius knew the futility of trying to change the laws. So he immediately, because of his regard for this man of integrity, he wanted to spare him what the penalty would be. And he began to work trying to find a loophole around this so that he could pull Daniel out of danger. And in their day and time, when someone was accused of a capital crime, such as this, the thing was that their swift judgment, their punishment is to be handed out within that day, okay? And he worked from the time they made him aware, right after the breakfast meal, the first time that Daniel had prayed. They came to him and they said, You got to do something. You got to do something. He's supposed to be thrown into the lion's den. That's what you said. That's what you signed. That's what needs to happen. Darius only had till the end of day to find a loophole, and he couldn't do it. He looked and he searched. He said he searched even until sunset. In verse 14 at the end it says, He kept exerting himself to rescue him. This was really upsetting to Darius. He had been outwitted. He had been shown that he wasn't as diligent as he needed to be. He was fixing to lose one of his greatest assets in this barbaric place that he was ruling over now. He probably recognized within himself that it was his own pride that led him here, and he was doing everything he could, and he was not finding any loopholes. I can almost see him calling men that he trusted, probably even Daniel himself. Help me find a loophole, and it couldn't be found. You know, Daniel is in the minority here. The only really honest man out of all the rulers. We have a little bit of knowledge about dishonest people in our government, don't we? But all of these were. It sounds as though King Darius, who was a very prideful man, and Daniel, a man of integrity, were the only two to really be trusted. And I want you to notice that Daniel still got on his knees and still prayed 3 times a day. He was faithful, and he believed, and he trusted in God. Let's go to verse 16, and we will read through 20. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke to Daniel, and he said, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace, and he spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. The king arose at dawn and at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" The king could find no way to exonerate Daniel, so he followed the law. They took Daniel and cast him into the lion's den. They put a rock across the top. And something I didn't catch until probably about the 18th time of reading this, it wasn't just a signet ring of the king that sealed the rock, the opening. It was also the nobleman. His nobleman signed it. It was under the penalty of death if anyone tried to mess with that rock. There was 2 things that I think Darius was doing. Following the letter of the law was one. And just in case Daniel's God did save him, he was preventing anybody else from opening up that and maybe shooting an arrow through Daniel, making sure that Daniel was done away with. He put that rock in place. Can you see him with his slow, shoulders hunched, walk back to his room? Can you see him replay everything that had happened within the last 24 hours over and over in his mind? The dread he would have, that he expected to have when he got up the next morning and would go down to check the lion's den. He didn't sleep that night. Normally a king would go to bed at night after having musicians play or dancers dance or a feast of some kind. Well, he denied all recreational entertainment. His heart was hurting. He was so upset with the thought of losing Daniel. He was so upset with figuring out he had been manipulated. No ruler wants to know or recognize or admit that they had been manipulated. Didn't get any sleep that night. As soon as he didn't have to have a lantern or a candle, as soon as enough light broke that he could see his way, he left. And don't think for a minute he left by himself. His door would have been guarded. There would have been a lot of people up because they knew what was going on. And he traveled as fast as he could go to get to the lion's den to check on Daniel. So in verse 20, he called out to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the Living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? How far away did he start shouting that, I wonder? Not very far away. Then he heard something in verse 21 that would have brought relief to his heart, a little bit of fear to his heart, and joy to his heart. In verse 21, then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever." Daniel is not afraid to show when he has disgust for a leader. We saw that in chapter 5. He didn't say, "O king, live forever," to that king, did he, at the end of chapter 5? But he's using it here. He said, "O king, live forever." And what a sweet, sweet sound that would have been to Darius' ears. My God, Daniel continues, my God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you. O king, I have committed no crime. The king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted God. Do you remember when Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were brought out of the furnace? How they examined them. They could find no burned threads, no scorched threads, not even the smell of smoke on them. When they brought Daniel up out of the den, they were amazed. His clothing was not rent. He had no scratch or bite marks anywhere on him. Hair probably wasn't even ruffled. And he looked rested. God sent his angel. Daniel knew exactly where his salvation had come from. He's talking to Daniel while the rock is still covering the mouth, I believe, of the den. And as he breaks that seal himself and has his men push back that rock, Daniel is reassuring him, I'm fine, Darius, King Darius, I'm fine. I'm fine. My God has taken care of me. He knew I was innocent before him and innocent before you. In verse 24 through 26, the king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives, into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, the nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. Those 122 men, those that were at the palace or compound, were gathered up. Not only them, but their wives and children. This was capital punishment that not only took you, but it took your whole family out. This is the way they did back then. It was a deterrent, because if I did awful, I knew it wasn't just on me, it'd be on my whole family. And King Darius, to the letter of the law, the guilty parties were thrown into the lion's den. Can you hear the shrieks, the cries, the screams, the scuffling as the guards drug those men toward the opening, and those women and those children toward the opening of the den? the roar of the lions. This was real. This is not just a nice little story to tell. This happened. And Darius was so awed by how God had protected Daniel that he made a decree. You've got to start acknowledging his God. Tremble before his God. You know, I can instruct somebody that you must do this, that, and the other, and they may do it. But they're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they're being told a lot of times. The last two verses are Darius is talking about Jehovah God. He said, he delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel is mid-80s, and he lived a very influential life. Influential not only for his people, but influential in how the kings ruled and reigned over this Gentile nation. This was written, a history of Daniel's life. Starting in chapter 7, we're going to be studying those dreams and those visions that he had. But remember, God rewards fervent prayers. He rewards consistency, faithful, consistent prayer. Daniel gives us that example. And it's one that's very hard to follow unless you make Jesus Christ a very important part of your life. Daniel prospered. What a wonderful thing to say. Daniel prospered. He prospered because he was a man of integrity, a man of faith. Talk to you next time. Goodbye.